Start with a quick announcement, and then Ethan got a quick announcement, and then Cassie is going to take it away. And Ken's finding us a 9-volt battery for the microphone. He's the only person in the entire building that has a 9-volt battery car. That should not be surprising to anyone.
Ken, I've got a couple.
The oxygen. If you want to shut it off,
Ken, I've got a couple in mine.
we're all dead. Be nice to Ken. As you know, Brandon Harder is not here. He just sent an email to all of us. So we're celebrating for him in his absence, but he kept it quiet for a long time. But he got hitched, he got married, and the deal is done. So when he gets back, congratulations. I know we all love him. There's not too many people in this world that are as wonderful and likable as that guy. He's a gem. So when you see him, congratulate him, and just say, you know, whatever you need to say to him. But I know he's not here. But he just said the lovely, you know, all of us. Anyway, Brandon is that's where he is on his hunt.
And real quickly, we need to acknowledge that Danielle is going to be leaving us for a little bit on our next new adventure. So Danielle, on behalf of all of us, good luck on your mat leave and with everything that's to come. We're so excited for you. And
I just wanted to, before we start, introduce our presenter today. Her name is Kelsey Penny. She works with Children's Office of Services of British Columbia. She's doing a presentation today on understanding emotional regulation and what that means for us as teachers. I will be sending you all out a live stream link to refer to later, and the slides as well shortly in about 2 minutes. So the slides will all be there. If you have your laptops, you can look at the slides and refer to them as we go. But a round of applause for our...
Thank you. And if anyone who's live streaming can message Cassie just to make sure that we are live, you can hear me, and it's working for you, that'd be great. I'm Kelsey. Thank you so much for having me today. It has been fun to watch you guys come in together and chatting, and you can tell how close you guys are as a community. So I feel lucky to be able to spend some time with you. As Kelsey mentioned, I work for Children's Autism Services of British Columbia. I am an education consultant, so I've been working with classroom teams for the past 12 years. I just recently moved to British Columbia in Edmonton, Alberta for the first 10 years of my career, but I'm happy to be here where it's not -40. So thank you for having me, and today we're going to go through some information that's very connected to the work you do right in your classrooms. So the goal for today is for you to walk out of here with lots of things to try, with lots of questions that you can kind of ask yourself as you go through. And if there's any questions while we go, please feel free to put up your hand. We can talk through them live. Because you're all one staff, if you want to talk about specific contexts and things that are happening in your classroom, we can work through those. I just ask that you don't use first and last names, but you can definitely mention a student and the things you're seeing, and we can talk about that as a group. That can be a great opportunity as well. So Cassie's going to run my slides today, so I'm hoping she'll be able to do that with a click of a button there. So we'll hit to that first slide, Cass. Thank you. So today, our goal is to rethink our approach to learner equity. And I use the word equity because we're not talking about equal. We're not talking about every student having the same thing. We're talking about every student having what they need. So that's the difference there with that wording. So the way that we're going to do that is we're going to target a couple of different learning areas. So the first one that we're going to look at is emotional regulation. So it's a word that gets used a lot, but I just want to talk through what it means, how we can really target that in our classroom settings. We're also going to look at reframing our language to shift our perspective in problem behavior and how to manage challenging behavior in our classrooms. We'll also look at social emotional learning and what are some of the resources we can use to target some of that overall universal learning. And then I'll make sure I spend some time talking about universal design for learning as well, which I know is a topic that we use a lot of that language as well, but how can we really target those specific learning needs in our classroom settings through resources, strategies, and assessment. So that's kind of our focus for today. But before we get started, I want to talk a bit about the philosophy. So traditionally, in school settings, in community settings, we have a medical model of disability. So we see kids based on their diagnosis. In order to get a diagnosis, there has to be something wrong, right? In order to get service, there has to be something wrong, which is a model that we're really shifting away from. And education is actually one of the leaders in that. The other area that's leading that is health. So we're starting to see a wraparound approach, moving from this child needs to have something wrong or have a deficit in order to access support, which is very problem-focused, right? It's looking at the child being unable to enter a place or be able to access a curriculum. It's looking at something that's wrong, and so it's very negative and deficit focused. And so if we look at the other model we see here, it's that social model. So we're really shifting our language and shifting our approach in education to be more focused on what are the things around the child that are barriers for them. So looking at our own settings, our environments, our philosophies, as well as our practices and procedures. So this is what we're really going to dive into today are these three areas. And how can we bring it down and reduce the barriers to give more access? And when we do that, we include everyone. Because now we're not looking at what kids have a disability and need support. We're looking at all kids need support in some way. And how do we plan for that? How do we organize ourselves in our attitudes, in our environments, and in our practices and procedures? When we do that, that makes our job a lot easier. As a teacher, I had nothing more than fear when a consultant came into my room, because all I was thinking is they're going to give me 25 strategies for this one kid, and the next time they come, I'm not going to implement any of them. Because I have 25 strategies for every kid on an IEP. And now I have all these complexities that I'm trying to individually support. So when we think about this as becoming more barrier focused, we can then plan universally for things that may be supported for some, but are accessed by all. So that's sort of that shift in philosophy that I really want to work through today. So we're looking at the barriers rather than the individual themselves. So in looking at determining and removing social barriers, there's sort of three main focuses that we're going to have today. So we'll go through three different sort of overarching themes and talk specifically about resources, about ways that we can implement those things together. So the first of those is our attitude of belief. So this is how we sort of set the stage as a team. This is how we want to think about shifting our language together as we talk about students and about our classroom settings to really think about emotional regulation and need for support rather than challenging behavior or problem behavior. So I'll work you through some of that as we go through this morning. The second one is really looking at our environment. So how do we then implement regulation and social emotional learning in our classroom settings? And then the last one is really looking at procedures and practices. So using universal design for learning to really support what you're teaching, you're assessing, and what you're supporting in your classrooms. So we will go through the first section and then we will have a quick break. We want to honor that. So I think maybe at 10:15 we'll take a break, 15 minutes, and then we'll jump back in. But again, if you have questions as we go, please let me know. So in starting, we're going to start with our first area, which is our attitude and beliefs. So this is the step of rethinking challenging behaviors. So I usually liken this to the game of whack-a-mole. If you've played it before, you know that you have a big mallet and you have moles popping up all throughout the game. The more you hit, the faster it gets, right? One goes down, another pops up. One goes down, another pops up. But before long, it becomes really hard to keep whacking them all. You start to run out of the ability to do so. This is how I see problem behavior. If we look at one behavior, the child is growing, the child is spitting, the child is screaming, and we try to just stop that one behavior in the classroom, what we often see is more behaviors popping up, and manifesting in a different way. Because what we're looking at is that challenging behavior as a solo thing. We're not looking at it as a reason for something or there's a lot behind that behavior. We're just looking at he needs to stop that. So we start to put in things like consequences or punishments to stop that behavior, to extinguish that behavior. But what we often then see are more behaviors popping up in different places. So if we can think about shifting our perspective in how we see and think about problem behavior, that's going to allow us to really target social emotional learning and emotional regulation universally. It really helps us move into a bigger picture approach. So what we see is we can view that visible behavior as its own problem, or we can look at the bigger picture, which will give us a much more lasting change and a much more effective approach to supporting the child to build better skills. So we want to kind of move away from the whack-a-mole approach and move more into a big picture approach. So the first way we can do that is we can start by shifting our language. So that's what we're going to first touch on here, because one of the big things that happens is we get into meetings or we get into an after-school conversation with a colleague and we start to really talk about, he's doing it and it's annoying me and I don't like it and I can't handle it and it's making me mad and I just don't know what else to do. And we start to really get fixated on that one thing we're seeing, right? Oh, every single time I try to start, he can't stop talking. He talks the whole class. And we're getting really stuck on the behavior we're seeing rather than really starting to think about what are the things that are causing this, what are the reasons behind it, because that's where we're going to get the bang for our buck. So I'll talk a lot about that in the next few slides. So this is a quote that I have printed on my desk, and it really helps me in meetings to reflect and reshift the way that I'm presenting information when I'm looking at challenging behavior. A child's challenging behavior is a problem to the adult. To the child, it's a solution. So I was working in a high school classroom with a student and an EA, and they were working on some kind of vocabulary-based work. He was working at a different grade level than some of his peers, and he had some language. He could say yes, he could say no, he could say all done, he could say more, but primarily nonverbal. So he was working with his EA, we had a great relationship. She was helping him work on this activity. Then I started to notice him getting a little bit fidgety at his desk. Then the activity kept going, and I started to see him pushing away from the desk. And then he used his words. He said, all done. And the EA, who's got a great relationship with him, said 2 more turns, then all done. They've been working on kind of expanding how long he would stay at activities. But at that point, he was already past the point. He was a bit frustrated, and he pushed back even further. And she said, no, 2 more turns, then all done. And then he spit in her face. So, for us, that's a problem. We don't want to have that behavior happening in our classroom. But for him, that was a solution. That was his way of getting space, of getting away from the situation. And he had actually tried a couple of other things, right? He'd been fidgety, he showed us those early signs of dysregulation. He tried pushing himself away originally, and he even tried using his words. But what happened was, we didn't honor those early signs, and then we got to a point where he was past the point of regulated, and then he picked a solution that wasn't as appropriate or wasn't safe. And so when we're thinking about what is the problem, we need to start thinking about who is it a problem for. Because for us, that's a huge problem. I'm not going to tell you that I would like to see your students spitting in the classroom, but what I would like to see is us thinking about why couldn't he pick a better solution? What is he lacking? What skill is he lacking to pick a better solution? Because if we stick to we to stop the spitting, that might get us a great behavior plan, or we might have some sort of reinforcement system, but that's just going to stop the spitting. He's still going to have that underlying issue, right? He's still going to have that inability to use his language or to use his tools to help us know this is making me upset. And so when we start to really shift into solution-based language, we can really think about putting our energy into what are the things that are going to help him longer term, and how can I reflect on the ways that I can be more supportive to those needs. Because what that EA and I really reflected on was she maybe pushed him one step further than she could have in that situation, which escalated his behavior. So she said, next time, when he uses that verbal all done, I'm going to honor it today, because I know that that's going to help him build that trust. And then next time, with more support, I can expect more of him. So we'll talk about what more support looks like as we go through the slides, but this idea of solution-based thinking can really help us get further in our understanding and further in our planning around how to support reduction in some of those behaviors. The other quote that I always have up is, behavior is communication the child cannot put into words. So I know that I was chatting with Cassie about your guys' student population. You don't have a ton of kids who are completely nonverbal, but we do have kids who do have challenges pulling their language out or processing language at the same rate as their peers. So when we think about what we see in the classroom, the behaviors we're seeing in the classroom, in the hallway, in the cafeteria, at sports games, those are all behaviors the child can't, or communication the child can't put into words. If they had the ability to give you a long-winded reason why they're feeling the way they're feeling, or even to be able to recognize their emotion and act on it, they would use their words. but they're choosing to use a physical expression, whether that's kicking, screaming, protesting, bolting, whatever that behavior is, what we can see that as is the inability to communicate what they're really thinking, feeling, or needing. And if we can move from the behavior is something the child is doing at their own free will to make me upset or to be sort of disruptive in class or whatever it is, we'll only stay focused on that problem-based strategy. But if we can move towards this idea that this is a communication, what is the child trying to communicate? And even if it is a verbal behavior, if the child stands up and says, "This is stupid," that's a behavior too, and yes, that is a communication, but what is that child actually trying to communicate? Is it, "I have no idea what I'm supposed to be doing in here"? Is it, "I hate this, I'm so bored"? Is it, "I'm overwhelmed by this environment"? What would they be saying if they had the ability to process and pull that language right in that moment? So if we can move to that kind of communication-focused thought as well, that really can help us to think about, well, what skills are they, what gap is there that's preventing them from actually using that much language? Or if they're not using full sentences yet, if they're just kind of emerging language speakers, what kinds of visual supports do I need to incorporate? What kinds of augmentative communication do I need to encourage? Because we need to help them find better ways to share their messages. That's going to lead to a reduction of physical behavior as well. If I can tell you that I'm mad, or that I'm upset, or that I'm bored, or that I'm overwhelmed, and then you respond to that, say, "Great, let's take a break," or "Let's break it down, let's look at the tasks, let's look at the steps," that's going to reduce the need for that problem behavior, right? If they can give us a better way to share their message. But it's a two-way street. We have to also be ready to hear the message, which we'll talk more about too, in that idea that we want to really be thinking about. If a child's going to use a more sophisticated strategy, they're going to pick a better solution, the only way they're going to be reinforced to do that again is if they get a response from us. If they pick a better solution and say, "I'm all done," we may need to honor that instead of pushing them further and keep going and going, because now they've picked a better solution than hitting or throwing or screaming. Because if we just shift that idea that, "Yeah, you're right, thank you for using your words," that reinforces that words have power, and then we can start to look longer term at bringing different expectations back. So when I talk about the idea of responding and sort of going with what the child says or does, I don't mean that we're going to always have our kids taking the lead. They're not going to always be the ones that are making their own expectations or telling us when they're done or when they're wanting to do something different. But we are going to need to think about the scaffolding and supporting them to really be able to manage more expectation. Because if right now you're putting expectation on your kids and you're seeing challenging behavior, it probably means they don't have the skill set to follow through on that expectation. So we got to come back to teaching that. I know you guys have a really neat setup here where you have kids in inclusive settings, but they also have dedicated time where they have smaller group work, these learning assistants. And that's a really great model to really be thinking about what are some of those more intense, small group, direct things that we need to learn or build that we might be able to do in LA, but how can we also think about those inclusively? Because if we can be repetitive in how we're doing things in all classroom settings for these kids, they're going to build that skill so much quicker than if they're just getting that repeated set up. So that's kind of the focus today as well. How can we all have the strategies and have the language to really be thinking about this universally in all of the classroom settings and all of the subject areas? Any questions so far? Okay. So we often think about giving consequences and punishment when we see behavior because it's sort of what we've been ingrained to do. As parents, if you're a parent, you may be thinking, "Yeah, I do that all the time. If my kid doesn't do this, I give them a consequence." Neurotypical kids may be able to follow and understand that this action that I did led to me not getting something later. But if you have any kids with neurodiversity in their kind of different ways of thinking, their different developmental stages, many kids cannot connect that what I did in English class is now leading me to not get gym. Right? So I work with a lot of kids with autism. Autism really involves a lot of work in theory of mind. So there's often a lot of lack of theory of mind, so lack of ability to take another person's perspective, or lack of ability to know what other people are thinking and feeling. That's a big skill to learn. For some of our kids, it's even a big skill to know that another person's in their environment, or that someone's communicating with them. So when we try to give a consequence, there often isn't that connection to what I did earlier has lost me this privilege now. So we often don't see a reduction in behavior anyway when we give that consequence. So if we can really shift instead of thinking of that solution and thinking about it as communication, we get to the bottom of what we really want to get to, which is skill development. We want our kids to be able to cope better. We want our kids to be able to engage more. We want our kids to be able to perform academically, perform socially, perform developmentally. That's where we're going to get our bang for our buck, is if we can figure out those underlying reasons that are causing that visible behavior. So it sort of looks a little bit like this. We'll go to this next slide, Cassie. I'm going to show you a video now. This is Dr. Ross Green. He is very big in the world of collaborative problem solving. So if you have some time, this is definitely a resource. I'm going to list lots of resources today. Most of them are in the slides. But Ross Green has lots of great resources and actually lots of free stuff on his website around thinking about helping students think about their own behavior and where they're at. So I'll watch this video and we can talk about that.
So I've got my essay written, and I've been working on it for about a week. So now I'm going to show you how I use Grammarly to edit.
We don't have it on the screen there, Cass.
Let's go, Cass.
Okay, you did a pretty good job. You did a pretty good job, right?
That joke never gets old.
Especially when the going gets tough. No philosophy, no God. The most important theme of collaborative problem solving is this one. Kids do well if they can. Now, nobody ever falls off their chair at the sight of kids do well if they can. It's only an earth-shattering philosophy. If you consider a much more popular alternative philosophy that floats around out there called kids do well if they wanna. No, kids do well if they can, and kids do well if they want are two completely different philosophies. And they have completely different ramifications for what you're going to do to or with this kid to make things better. Let's think about kids do all if they want for a second. If you've got a kids do all if they want mentality, and you're working with a kid who's not doing well, and the reason you think he's not doing well, by virtue of your philosophy, is because he doesn't wanna. I've been thinking about kids do all if they wanna for a long time. Here's the conclusion I've come up with about kids do all if they wanna. It's wrong. Flat out, dead wrong. I ask myself, why would any kid not want to do well? Don't all of us do the best we can in the circumstances we find ourselves in? Well, the kids do all if they want mentality has those questions covered with concepts like secondary gain, attention seeking, unmotivated, coercive, limit testing. We're going to have those babies put to bed by around 11 a.m. this morning. When you really think about them, they don't make much sense. When you really put them to the test, they don't make a great deal of sense. But let's say they do make sense. Even if kids do well if they wanna is right, and now you know I think it's wrong, it's narrow. Because you see, it greatly narrows the role that you can play in the life of a kid who's not doing well. Because if you think a kid isn't doing well because he doesn't wanna, I can only think one thing for you to do. Only one role for you to play in the life of this kid. Make him wanna. And we have the technology for making kids wanna. How do you make a kid wanna? You reward the behaviors you like and you punish the behaviors you don't. You give him the incentive to do well based on the belief that he didn't have the incentive to do well in the first place, and you are now in the business of making kids wanna. I sure do hope you're right about why he's not doing well, because if you're wrong, and you're busy making a kid wanna, and he already does wanna, you run the risk of making things worse, or at the very least, not being as helpful as you might have wanted to be. I'm a kids do well if they can guy. I think if this kid could do well, he would do well. Something must be getting in his way. Your role just changed. Your role just changed. You've just flipped from thinking the kid isn't doing well because he doesn't wanna, and therefore thinking that your role in life of this kid is to make him wanna, is something a lot harder, and in my experience, a lot more productive. You've just shifted to kids do well if they can, and what's your main role now? Figure out what's getting in his way, that you can help him. You can't help him if you don't know what's getting in his way. Biggest favor you can do a challenging kid is to find me, at long last, with a person who figures out what's getting in his way. You can see, if he's still challenging, pretty surefire bet. Nobody's figured it out yet. The key theme of collaborative problem solving, the key philosophy, if you remember nothing else from everything I say, I hope you remember that if this kid could do well, he would do well, because kids do all if they can.
So this concept of kids do all if they can is what we're really diving into today, right? We're really thinking about what are the things that our kids are really needing support with, or that they're lacking in their skill set. And sometimes that's really obvious. Sometimes we have kids that have very limited verbal communication or very limited social understanding. We know that those kids are going to struggle to stay regulated, to communicate their wants and needs, to be able to process the language, the expectations. Those are kids that we already are thinking about strategies for. We know from them from years previous and what's helping them in the classroom. We know that different things like having more visuals or being more predictable, those are things that are going to help them. What about the kids where you kind of leave some days thinking, oh, he just did that to make me mad today, or he really annoyed me or really made me feel upset, and I don't really know where to go next. And it happens. I mean, I want to say it's never happened, and I've always thought the best of every child, but there are days where I leave in my car and I go, what the heck? Like, what happened today? Those are the kids that we really need to think about reaching in and thinking, what is it? What is it that they need support with? Because kids do well if they can, right? We want our kids to have success. We want our kids to feel like they are supported in their classroom settings. And sometimes we have those supports already set up. But are there kids, and can you reflect on your own classrooms and think, well, yeah, there is that one kid I'm having a really hard time reaching. Or I really don't understand why every single day he sits there slumped in his desk with his headphones in, not responsive to anything I'm doing. Are there kids you can think about that maybe we could talk about today? Are there any kids that you're really as a team thinking, oh man, we'd love to walk through this idea because we can't come up with a reason why. We are thinking, no, he's just really a mystery to us. We are still trying to figure out what is that thing that he's lacking or needing support with. And if you do have one of those, after the break we will talk a bit about some case study work if you want to bring one up. And it might help us to give you ideas. Because I often sit in meetings with teachers and they say, well, we tried this, 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 and this. And I say, great, those are all 4 things I would suggest. You've gotten way further than we already were when we started. But let's look at it from this angle, or let's look at it a little bit differently. And if you can involve other people, that can be really helpful. Many of you teach the same students, right? They come into your classes throughout the day. Can you collaborate with a partner and say, hey, I'm having this thing happening in my classroom, are you seeing the same thing? That can help us determine, is it environmental? Is it subject area focused? Is it expectation focused? Is it personal communication styles? What are the things that are the same in the different classrooms? What are the things that are different? When we can start to work through it from that solution focus of, okay, well in math, he's really able to stay regulated, he's focusing, he's really engaged, but in drama, he's absolutely lost. He's never engaged, he's never involved with the group. Well, math class versus drama class are very different environmentally, right? Very structured, very predictable versus very free and open. That can be really challenging for kids who have a hard time with expectations or with following through on routines. So what kinds of supports are happening in math class that we can maybe emulate or add to the drama routine to help to reduce those barriers? So when we start to look at collaborating together across curriculum and across subjects, that can really help us dive into the reason or the root cause of what we're seeing in those settings. If it's only happening in one classroom, that helps me to know that there's something working in the other classrooms that's not working in this environment. And how can we be more repetitive in what supports we're offering throughout the classroom day? Or if it's more of a skill gap, if it's something that is required, and we're going to talk about executive functioning here, but if it's something that is a skill that's not there, and we're seeing that behavior through all of these classes, that might be something we work on with a smaller group, like learning assistants, or with an educational assistant, or just adding some more supports universally. So let's talk a bit about that. So this is a picture, and it's a bit small, you'll have it in your slides. This is a raw screen overview of that video. It's basically looking at moving from won't language to can't yet. So it's kids do well if they can. We're looking at moving from being willful, the child is willful, the child's defiant, moving from rewards and punishments, over to looking at the stressors, looking at the barriers, looking at the skill deficits, and focusing our support there. It also really looks at moving from the child's experience being frustration or shame or overwhelming to a feeling of being supported and a feeling of being strengthened. So when we help our kids to build those skills, they see less challenging behaviors on themselves. They see more regulation. They see more ability to participate with their peers. Because this can be really hard, especially, guys, as a group. Kids are noticing each other a lot more than when I'm in a kindergarten classroom. When a kid's having a full meltdown at 5 years old, the other kids keep playing. You hardly ever notice it. But here in these settings, this is so socially overwhelming for our kids who are not quite fitting in. For our kids who are not able to act in the way they want to, their bodies are not giving them that opportunity. That's really socially overwhelming. They know they have that awareness and their peers have that awareness. So this work, this moving the shift to can't yet language, can be super powerful for them too at their age. So there is a little quote there at the bottom too, that you can't see it, but see a kid differently, you see a different kid. And that's Dr. Stuart Shanker. I will show you some of his resources. He developed a self-reg curriculum, so it's like a self-regulation curriculum and supports. He also has lots of great free resources, so that's another resource that you can find in here. So, when we think about this solution-focused language, what I really like to think about it as is an iceberg. So we're looking at 80% of our effort needs to be focused on the underlying barriers, the skill gaps, and the factors that lead to dysregulation. So what we're seeing at the top is our behavior, right? Whatever the behavior is, you can think of it in your head, pick one kid, think of that behavior. What we want to focus on instead is all the stuff that's happening underneath. And we're going to work through some of that today, but that's where we're going to see those areas of skill gap. We're also going to see areas that are leading to dysregulation, because sometimes it's not a skill, sometimes it's this kid doesn't sleep at all. This kid doesn't get any proper nutrition. This kid has constant headaches, constant sinus infections. Those are things that really make it hard to participate and learn, right? So if we can dip into that under part of the water, that's where we're going to get the biggest long-term return. That kid's going to build skills not only for the rest of your school year, but for the rest of their schooling career and into their adulthood. So when we put 80% of our time into that, that means we're shifting the way we're teaching, the way we're supporting them, the way we're building supports universally throughout the school and throughout our classrooms. And we're also looking at, are we seeing significant change throughout the year, right? Are we seeing those skills being built? Are we seeing independence starting to happen with some of those skill sets? So that's an important thing to really dive into, is what's happening where we can't see it. We're seeing the visible behavior, but we're going to dive deeper and look at what's underneath. So this is a quote from Ross Green as well. Challenging kids are challenging because they are lacking the skills to not be challenging. So when we think about it that way, print that one off if you want, but whenever you're having that frustrating day to think he was so challenging today, what is the reason? What is the deeper root cause of that? And how can we get to more supports for that? All right, I have another video for you. It's the last Ross Green video, I promise, but he's a great presenter and very well-spoken, so we'll jump into this one.
As you all know, a great deal of the intervention that takes place in schools takes place in the heat of the moment, emergently, reactively, especially with our behaviorally challenging students, and not in this model. In this model, 99.9% of what you're doing is planning, proactive. Now come the big questions. How can we be planned and proactive when we never know when the kid's going to blow? When they're always getting upset out of the blue? When they're so unpredictable? Here are the answers. The kid is not unpredictable. The kid is not blowing up from out of the blue. You know exactly when the kid is going to get upset if you answer two questions right up front. And those two questions are why and when. As in, why are challenging kids challenging? Why is this challenging kid challenging? When are challenging kids challenging? When is this challenging kid challenging? Now we're going to get to the answers to those questions very quickly. But first I'll just let you know, those are not the questions we spend most of our time talking about in our meetings and between ourselves. Those questions begin with the word what. I'll get to those soon. Let's start with why. Why are challenging kids challenging? The answer to that question has been provided to us by the last 40 to 50 years of research on behaviorally challenging kids. And believe it or not, 40 to 50 years of research can be summarized in one sentence. And here it is. Challenging kids are challenging because they're lacking the skills to not be challenging. That was it. Challenging kids are challenging because they're lacking the skills to not be challenging. Notice I didn't say anything about the kid's neighborhood. That's not it. There's well-behaved kids coming out of the same neighborhood. Notice I didn't say anything about the kid's family. That's not it. It might not be helping. The family in the neighborhood might not be helping, but there are usually well-behaved kids coming out of the same family. I didn't say anything about the kid's level of socioeconomic status. I didn't say anything about the kid's country of origin. All I said was challenging kids are challenging because they're lacking skills to not be challenging.
So let's talk about those skills now. Let's talk about the things that some of our kids might be struggling with or might be underdeveloped in that will really help us to gear towards what strategies we can then use with those kids. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is emotional regulation. And this is not specific to children with disabilities. This is a human process. This is something that we all developed. We started as babies. We emotionally regulated by screaming our heads off until our mom or dad did something to help us. We moved to a toddler phase where we started to learn some language. But we kind of lost that sometimes when we had a huge meltdown because we couldn't pull that language out. We develop this. It's a developmental trajectory. We start to move towards more sophisticated strategies. We move from needing support from others to being able to regulate ourselves. And then we start to learn the social expectations of regulation. You know that there are certain things today that are appropriate versus maybe less appropriate. Things that are maybe going to make me go, oh, that's an interesting choice. Because you're an adult, you have that self-regulation ability. So this is an underlying human process that really helps us to modulate our emotions, to think about our arousal levels, where are we at with our attention, our engagement. And so when we look at emotional regulation, it's something that happens to everyone. When we look at kids who have more diverse needs, there's often an atypical trajectory. So they maybe are still building some of those self-regulation skills. They may have more challenges with coping with certain things, more impulsivity, the inability to recognize early signs of dysregulation or of emotional change. And so when we think about those key factors, those key needs, we may have to look at some supports to help them be more effective in their own emotional regulation. So we look at the definition of it being a developmental process that matures across the lifespan. So it's not something that kids have or don't have. It's something that's needing to be developed and sometimes isn't as mature as their peers. And same thing with adults, right? Some of us have better self-regulation skills than others. Some of you can stay calm and patient and really hold it together even in the most stressful situations, where others might have a more anxious approach or may have a more overwhelmed approach to something like that. We have our own coping strategies, we have our own regulation strategies, and some of us are more skilled at that than others. And sometimes we go to a peer who we know has better emotional regulation skills to help us walk through a challenging situation or to help us through a crisis. Kind of that fight or flight method, right? So when we look at this, we want to think about matching our arousal levels, so our energy levels, with our environment. I often hear people say, oh, if you're going to be emotionally regulated, you've got to be calm. You need to be calm. You need to be calm. Do we always need to be calm? No, right? There's different times that call for different levels of energy. And so there's lots of different programs and resources that I could share with you. When we're teaching emotional regulation, we want to be careful not to put it in that box. Because there's times of the day when we actually want our kids to be alert and kind of ready to go and really energetic, versus times we want them to be more calm and regulated and ready to learn, right? So what I think about when I think about emotional regulation is it really boils down to being available for learning. Cass can push the button there, that'd be great, thank you. The availability for learning. So we always sort of look at emotional regulation as two states. You're either available for learning or you're dysregulated. There is no in between. If a child is dysregulated, so if they're in extreme dysregulation, we generally know that they're not ready for learning, right? If they're screaming, crying, hitting themselves, whatever that extreme dysregulation looks like, we're not generally trying to teach in those moments. But we are often trying to help them use their own strategies. Use your words, tell me what you need, pick a choice, make a choice, need a break. Often they're not even ready for that much input. Often they're at a point where they're so overwhelmed, they're so dysregulated, that what they just need in the moment, I'll give you some heat of the moment strategies, but what they really just need in that moment is support. But there's sort of a spectrum within emotional regulation. It's not regulated or completely extremely dysregulated. They sort of move, we all do, through a different spectrum throughout our day, right? We start to have different stimulus, things that get added to our plate or added to our day that really impact our regulation. So I like to think about it as a cup full of water. So every time something happens that challenges us, whether it's something annoying like a sound that's bothering us, if someone says something to us that we weren't prepared for, hey, you have that presentation due at the end of the day, that increases our regulation levels. So that's adding water. All of those inputs are adding water. What we have the ability to do as mature regulators is take water out, right? If I know, oh my gosh, I forgot about that presentation, I feel that moment of dysregulation, but I pick a strategy. I take a deep breath, I go to look at my day timer, I make some time to prepare for it, right? I self-talk. It's gonna be okay, I know what I'm talking about. It might not be as good as I wanted it to be, but I'll be able to do it. We have those skills to pull water out. What many of our kids don't have is that ability. So the water starts adding, and it keeps adding, and it keeps adding, until it tips, which is where we see extreme dysregulation. So our job then becomes helping them to notice that water filling up, helping them to pick strategies to get that water out. Because if we're seeing 0 to 100 in our classrooms, we're seeing that extreme dysregulation, that's a skill gap, right? They have an inability to pull themselves back to regulate it. They're going to need support, and they're going to need support proactively before they get to that point of dysregulation. So emotional regulation is something, again, that we all work through, and we all have strategies for, but our kids often need a lot more direct teaching of how they can manage their emotions, of how they can manage their energy levels, and their responses to stimuli in their environment. So when I think about regulation, there's lots of different factors that impact our kids' ability to be regulated. You might have some kids where you're like, I know when they're having a good day, I know when they're having a bad day, I know when they're starting to get upset, I know when they're completely upset. We might have other kids where you go, oh my gosh, they seem so happy, calm, available for learning, and it was like a switch went off. So there's different factors that definitely impact regulation, and these are just a few of them. When you start to think about kids with diverse needs, some of these things come up a lot more frequently, right? So those health factors, hunger, sleep, physiological needs. Many kids with autism, for example, have GI issues, so lots of stomach aches, digestion issues, sinus issues, dental issues. They're not seeing their doctors as often and dentists as often. It's super overwhelming. So there often are underlying health factors that also impact how we're feeling. Sleep can be a major challenge with that as well as sensory processing differences. Some kids, my sister, for example, she's not diagnosed with anything, or she wasn't as a kid. She could not sit at the dinner table at all. Everything we did set her off. And there was no real diagnosis for it or reason for it. When we were little, it was just she's overreacting. Someone would cut, she'd go, why did you cut like that? And it was like, what do you mean? Why did we cut like that? And then she'd run, scream, and go to her room. She, as an adult, has now been diagnosed with something called misophonia, which is a sensory processing disorder. So when she hears some of those sounds, her central nervous system fires up to a point where it overwhelms her completely, where she can't maintain her social ability to say, that's okay. It's totally overwhelming for her. She got a little set of hearing aids that have white noise that plays, And she puts those on when she eats, and now she can eat with anyone, anytime. That's a sensory processing difficulty. So when my sister walks into a setting like this, if she doesn't have her hearing aid, it's completely overwhelming, and she learns nothing. She takes nothing in. She told me, she says, all I think about is that guy over there has a coffee, and he's gonna drink it at some point. Right? Like, and that's what she's fixated on. So she used to have to record lectures, she had to do, and she didn't get diagnosed until she was 24. That, for a long time, it was just, she's got a bit of a thing. Right? And that's not, she's got no other diagnosis, it's misophonia. So that's sensory processing difficulties. If some kids are really sensitive to different things. Sometimes kids with autism, tags on the back of their shirt can be enough to make their system go crazy. Right? Something that's too tight, or not tight enough. I get that. If my sleeve is loose, I'm like, get this off, right? We all have our own little things we prefer, things we don't. But these sensory inputs are very impactful to our regulation. We can often tune them out, right? We can modulate that. There's some sort of thing happening back here with the microphone. It's a bit of a wall noise. And I'm tuning it out because I know that I can stay regulated. But for some kids, that's so distracting that they can't regulate. They can't say, I'm not going to focus on that. I'm going to focus on the teacher. So we think about those sensory differences. These are big classes, right? High school has a lot of kids in the same classroom. That is a lot more sensory overload than in a classroom with 10 or 12 kids, right? Some classes where you have a smaller class, that child might be more regulated because there's less to try to manage in the sensory environment. When we look at things like self-regulation skills, I'm sure you could argue, many of the students you have poor self-regulation skills. They have a really hard time noticing when they're upset, noticing when they're getting overwhelmed, and acting on it, right? During exam time, you have kids that you're like, oh my gosh, what is happening? You're having total meltdowns, you can't process anything, you're not organizing your things like you need to be. You need a lot of support during those times to really get through that stress. That can be a big part of self-regulation. Noticing how I'm feeling and acting on it. And so when you have kids who are having more diverse needs, often those are underdeveloped skills. Often they need a lot of adult or mutual support to notice and act on their emotions. Communication delays, of course, like if we have kids who have speech delays or challenges with communicating verbally or socially, that can make it really hard to regulate because it's frustrating when people don't know what I'm thinking or feeling, and it's frustrating and overwhelming to not know what's happening in my environment because I'm not taking that real information in. Negative emotional memory is a big one. Kids with autism, there's lots of research around this as far as if something happens and it's negative or overwhelming, there can be a very emotional response to that thing happening again. I liken it to a haunted house. When you're standing in line waiting to go to a haunted house, what are you feeling? What is that visceral emotional feeling? For some of you, it's excitement. I won't probably ever hang out with you at a haunted house because I don't like them. I hate haunted houses. I feel overwhelmed. I feel stressed. I feel anxious. I'm sweating. I am questioning why I'm coming back. Like, why did I come? I hate this. I know I hate this. That's because I have an emotional memory of that event. Not only do I remember the event, I remember how I feel. So when we have kids who have traumatic experiences or have situations like being put in a seclusion room, using a restraint, anything that's really overwhelming for them and their sensory systems, that can really lead to a feeling of that happening again, right? We have kids who go to the dentist and the next time they come, they completely refuse to come in because they're remembering that emotion. And that can really lead to challenges with our regulation. Difficulty predicting others and social communication delays kind of matches in with communication delays. And then we're going to talk a lot today about executive functioning challenges. Because at this age group, this is a major thing that happens with our kids that gets missed, not in that we don't know that they don't have those abilities, but missed in supporting them through it and building those skills. So there's a lot of factors here, right? When we think about a kid walking into a classroom, that's a lot of different things that can be managing in their own emotions and their own energy levels that could be impacting their regulation. So that's definitely a focus for us when we're looking at strategies and supports. What do these baseline look like, right? Because if there's issues with medical needs, we're not going to get very far with any of our skill development if we don't dive into that. I had a little one that was banging her head nonstop. It was 40 to 50 times a day. It was overwhelming for the family, for the school. They didn't know what to do next. They wanted to put a helmet on her. That was kind of the next step. So I came in to do some consultation with them. And they were talking so highly of her. They had such great expectations for her. but they just couldn't figure it out. They're saying, we let her basically do whatever she wants all day. But as soon as there's something that she's not allowed to have or she can't access, it's a complete 45-minute overwhelmed, completely dysregulated to the point where she doesn't stop until she physically falls asleep. She tires herself to a point where she sleeps. So I said, well, there's got to be something going on here. You're doing everything you can. You're using visuals, you're being predictable, you're incorporating her interests. So we actually ended up going to the Stollery in Edmonton, which is a dentist where you can be, where we have kids with special needs going with anesthesia, so they can really do a lot of work at the same time. It was a very overwhelming appointment to get her to, but we got her there. And she ended up having 7 teeth pulled, and she had blood work done, and they did x-rays while she was under. She had massive sinus infections and 5 teeth pulled. So you can imagine, when you get physically upset, you get frustrated, you get mad, blood rushes to your head, right? That overwhelming feeling and that pressure was then leading to her head banging. And there was no stopping it with strategies, there was no stopping it with a support plan. She needed medical intervention. Same thing with kids who have really limited feeding abilities. Reflux is something we really want to talk to families about. If they aren't eating very many things, it could be because it's actually painful, and they aren't able to tell us, they don't understand anything different than that feeling. So like when we get heartburn, it's like, oh yeah, I got heartburn, like, oh, this is overwhelming. When we have kids who constantly have reflux, that's just how eating feels. So they're not going to target saying, hey, it's hurting when I eat, because that to them is their natural process. Reflux and going on to medication for reflux can be a game changer for some kids. So speaking with parents about follow-up for medical, if you have a kid that has a new behavior like head banging, biting, anything connected to the mouth, or the nerves here, definitely get medical, dental especially, because that can be a really strong sign that something's going on. So that's one of the things that I've talked about here is we need to sort of pare back some of these factors before we can start thinking about supports we can put into place in the classroom. Because that's kids coming in every single day with a sinus infection that's going untreated. You can imagine how much they're going to be able to take in and how regulated they're going to be able to stay. So I look at this sort of as, when I'm building support plans, we look at these 4 different areas as our primary focuses to determine regulation. So we just talked about the first one. So that's those physiological and health needs. And then we talked a bit about the second one as well. So first we're going to dial out that. We're going to make sure we've determined are there any health or physiological needs that are leading to these challenging behaviors. The next one we're going to look at is our sensory processing. What is the child taking in the environment? What are the sensory inputs? And what are the things that they're managing throughout their day? Then we want to look at social communication skills. So if we have kids who do have speech delays or who are working on building their social communication, what can we do to target those areas? And I'll share some resources after. I think that's happening a lot in the LA cluster, because you guys are doing a lot of work on social understanding, social expectations, thinking about what other people are thinking about. Those are big things to work on that can absolutely lead to dysregulation, right? So this definitely needs to be a part of their plan. And then the big one that I want to talk about today is executive functioning. This is sort of the overarching skill set that really supports all these other things and really supports learning and development. So if you want to pull to the next slide, Cassie, we see this sort of this wheel, and I'll share these with you. Executive functioning has a lot of different factors that are involved with it. Many of your kids will likely have goals in these areas. If they have an IDP or if they don't. Many kids, typically developing kids and kids with diverse needs, often have challenges with executive functioning. So things like flexible thinking. Can the child make changes in their routines? Can they accept changes in their routines? Can they be flexible in making a different solution for something they don't like? Working memory. Self-monitoring is a huge one. Many kids can't monitor their own self-regulation, their own ability. Planning and prioritizing, that's probably something you're working on with all of your students. Prioritizing what's due, prioritizing what needs to be done first, prioritizing what you should focus on for this week versus next week. Task initiation, organization, impulse control, which is a massive area of focus for a lot of kids with diverse needs, but also takes a lot of time to really build sophisticated strategies for. And then emotional control is another one. So looking at understanding and responding to our emotions. So, just to pull a little bit of the research into this, I put a reference list at the end if you want to go back and look at any of the studies or things that we've been pulling from. Effective executive functioning performance has been highly correlated with increased productivity, enhanced self-esteem, higher income levels, improved job satisfaction, and heightened decision-making consistency. So these are things that you're probably already thinking about with your kids, right? When you're looking at preparing them for post-secondary, preparing them for employment, preparing them for transitions outside of high school, these executive functioning skills are the things that are going to lead to that success, right? Our ability to organize, our ability to plan and prioritize, our ability to have impulse control, have emotional control, these are all things that lead us to more success in our post-high school years. So this is something you're working on universally. When we have kids who are really struggling with their executive functioning skills, that's when we want to be targeting specific goals for developing some of those specific skills. And you can look at that wheel, that example, with your students and go through it. If you're working on building an IPP, some of those areas might be fantastic IPP goal areas, right? You really struggle to bring the right things to class. You're always going back to your locker to get that binder. You always forget your gym strip, or you always need a reminder on what to bring. How can we build some different ways for you to do that and be able to be more independent, bringing the right things to class? How do we help you build your organization skills? What kinds of strategies will help you to remember what to bring, to check in, to look and find information we needed? So those are great IPP bonuses if you have kids that are looking at goal setting. And even just for our full classroom setting. If you have lots of time where you're managing those kinds of things, hey everybody, you need to remember to bring that thing to class. Okay, 4 of you forgot it, go get it. Right? And that's not connected to a disability, that's not connected to anything, that's connected to that ability to organize, that ability to prioritize and plan. So we might have to do some direct modeling, some direct supporting strategies. And how can you become more efficient at this? How can you build this skill? Because this is a skill you need long term. Right? These are sort of the hidden curriculum components. These are the things that we're hitting in our curriculum concepts. These are the things that we're working on to well around our students. We want them to have the ability to say, that wasn't what I was planning on doing today, but I can be flexible, I can change my plan. Some of us are better at that than others, right? We have the ability to regulate and say, all right, not how I would have done it, but I'll accept that they did it that way and that's great, right? With that flexibility in thinking. So executive functioning is a really strong focus area for high school because often those earlier skills, like early communication skills, early emotional regulation skills have been targeted since kindergarten and early intervention for some kids. Those are really strong goal focuses. We have a child who's completely nonverbal, we're targeting communication heavily. We're figuring out what visuals work, we're looking at iPads, we're looking at AAC devices, we're looking at ways to build their communication. The goal is that by high school, they have some of that foundation. They're not needing that kind of early intervention style support. That being said, we might still have some students that come in with that, especially students that come in from other countries where early intervention or early support for autism or for FASD or ADHD, anxiety, aren't necessarily there or aren't necessarily developed. We may have students who are working kind of at that early level, but a lot of kids who really starting to work on some of these executive functioning skills, that kind of highest level of emotional regulation. Yes?
I'm with you, totally on board, executive functioning, but what I've really noticed lately, and I know a lot of my colleagues are noticing, is the impact of this pandemic on their executive functioning. Whereas if you took a typical 15-year-old 5 years ago as to a typical 15-year-old now, what can we do to support our neurotypical who have no diagnosis, have no, and their self-regulation, their executive functioning is completely, I don't want to say deficient, but not where.
And that's an amazing point. Just for our live stream, if you didn't hear it, we're talking about this pandemic and the impact that has had on executive functioning and on emotional regulation. Because I can notice myself as an adult, my small talk skills have gone out the window. Like, I can't socialize. I'm like, it's not a Zoom meeting, but I'm like, I don't know what to do. Like, it's a huge point. I really thank you for bringing it up. This group, this cohort of kids, hasn't known anything different than what they've had in the last 2 years. Especially your 8s and 9s who didn't ever come to this school before COVID, right? They managed a very different level of understanding come through elementary. The academic and executive functioning expectations at the high school level are completely different, right? Middle school especially, that's what we call it in Alberta, is that what your 8s and 9s call middle school? This cohort, this is already a high-risk cohort for executive functioning challenges. kids in middle school are at way higher risk of having gaps or challenges in their executive functioning and their emotional regulation. One factor of that is puberty. It really impacts how they think and feel. Another factor of that is the added expectation, right? You're all of a sudden moving to different classrooms, you need to organize your own things. In elementary school, it's easier to hide those challenges because the teacher kind of moves you through everything, right? Okay, everyone, get out your red binder. It's time for English. All of your binders are right underneath your desk. Then we move to middle school, and all of a sudden it's a free-for-all. It's like, here's your class schedule. Make sure you have what you need. You're going to have 7 different teachers who all have different styles and expectations. Off you go, right? That already was a massive jump. But COVID and the research that's going to come out of this sort of last 2 years is going to be astounding in the gap. The kids 2 years previous to this in grade 8 versus the kids this year in grade 8, it's going to be astounding. It's going to actually be, they're actually calling it a mental health pandemic that's going to be coming after this. Because we have kids who basically lived in anxiety and fear and stress for 2 years, and they're still going through this natural transition of having more expectation. So that's something that we really need to think about as a staff group. How do we think about those needs, and how do we build even stronger and more direct supports than we've had before? We may not have had to explicitly teach some of these executive functioning skills before. It might be more to come more naturally. Many of the kids would have picked up on that ability to use their schedule, ability to organize and manage their stuff. We might need to step back and pull our expectations back, knowing that these kids are likely 2 years delayed in that universally. Neurotypically, not just our kids with disabilities who are probably always going to be working on those skills. These are our typically developing kids. We still want to have high expectations for all kids, right? But with high levels of support. That's our idea of scaffolding, right? We're looking at what skill sets do they have, and how do we add supports to get them to the next step. And so the kids who have your lesson plans for grade 8 English 2 years ago probably need something different than the kids this year need. These kids this year probably need you to pull back. They might need more review of curricular concepts. They may need more direct planning and practice with their executive functioning. So it's really important that you take a look and think about and reflect on, have I changed the way I'm teaching these kids? Because they need it. They need a change. They need us to make an active change, to target some of these more hidden curriculum things to help catch them back up, right? We kind of went through 2 years where none of us had the ability to executive function. We couldn't plan. I still don't feel like I can plan. Like, they're like, we're free in 2 weeks. And I'm like, what does that mean? Like, what does it mean to me? What is it? Like, are we, or is it going to be the same thing over again? We have this lack of trust of when this ends or whatever we feel, right? So we as adults also have that need. We're all thinking about ways we can connect in, be more mindful, be able to regulate ourselves, be able to work through it. I'm sure you all went through it personally, returning to school. You probably had to take a lot of time to process this, right? So when we think about where our expectations are, that's where we're going to link in with your question. It's pulling our expectations back and looking at what skills do my students need support with. What on that wheel of executive functioning, can you go back down, Tess? What on this wheel are they able to do independently? And what on this wheel do they need support with? And that can be an actual classroom activity, right? You print this off, do some learner profiles, have students work through these, do some self-reflection, work on what do you see for yourself as a goal for the next month. We as a group are going to focus on planning and prioritizing. I'm going to introduce you to a visual schedule. I'm going to introduce you to Google Calendar. I'm going to introduce you to a couple different apps I'm going to show you today. We're going to practice them as a group. I'm going to model them in class. I'm going to make it a goal for myself as a teacher to show you these tools this month. And you're going to make it a goal for you as a student to use them. And if we get really explicit about that and we teach it directly, we can help to rebuild that gap. But we might have to change what we're doing, right? We might have to start back a little bit further and build that support up. We're still going to have those high expectations, and our kids are still going to move towards them. But those expectations need to look a little bit different with this age group specifically through this COVID pandemic. Thank you for your question. That's great. All right, so I've already talked a bit about some of the increased risk factors for students who do have diverse needs. We do have lots of kids with pre-existing health conditions, challenges with social understanding, sensory processing challenges, executive functioning skills. And the last one I want to talk about is interception. This is a new concept. When we talk about the senses, we know our 5 senses. There's 2 more that we talk about now, which are vestibular, which is our balance and our ability to balance in our environment, and proprioception, which is the feeling of our joints and muscles. So if you have kids that really like heavy work or really like deep pressure, that's likely proprioception needs. They're craving that deep feeling or that pressure. When you double high five someone, you get that feedback, that's proprioception. So the one we want to talk about today is really new in the field. It's called interception. This is the idea that what we have and feel physiologically and its connection to our emotions. So we always say, you feel mad. What does feeling mad actually feel like? For our kids, when I look at kids with autism specifically, that's a very abstract thing, right? I feel mad, I feel happy, I feel stressed, I feel frustrated. We have to actually explicitly teach what that feeling is. So the interception curriculum, and I'll share, there's a resource in here on this, it really looks at creating physical feelings for our emotions. When I'm feeling stressed, my heart is beating fast. My palms are feeling sweaty. It's hard for me to look at anyone specifically. I feel itchy. I feel tight. I feel hot. I feel cold. Whatever the emotion is, and it's very personal and individual to each child. We all feel different, but there's certain characteristics we can teach, and we always start with the hands. When we're happy or we're excited, we often have loose and cool feeling hands versus hot, when they might feel tight and hot when we're mad. So we can teach these things through the different body parts. So if you're working with kids who are really struggling with self-regulation, this is the bridge between mutual regulation to self-regulation. In order to self-regulate, you have to be able to understand what you are feeling. You won't be able to pick a strategy for feeling overwhelmed if you don't know what overwhelmed feels like. So if you have kids that are really working on this, there's an OT named Kelly Mahler, M-A-H-L-E-R. I think I've linked her website in here too. She focuses on interception. She's got lots of great free webinars, and it really looks at those resources and supports for helping us to understand what our body's feeling. And we don't want to overlook that, right? We don't want to assume that kids know what they're feeling. Because they can always, sometimes kids can label happy, mad, sad, angry, surprised, stressed from a picture they've seen 100 times. We do it all the time. I have a little 5-year-old I'm working with right now where we're looking at pictures of the emotions, and he was making all the faces with me. But he's imitating what he's seeing on that picture. If I asked him how he's feeling, he can't answer me. But if I say happy, he goes happy and smiles, because he knows that's what he's supposed to do. But when we dive deeper into interception and how are you feeling, that will help us connect those self-regulation skills in a little bit of a different way. So definitely check those resources out if you do have kids who are working through that. So I want you to take a couple minutes at your tables. I know you don't want to. We're going to do a bit of small discussion, just quickly. Do you have any students who presented with challenging behavior or who seem hard to reach? How can you shift your perspective or the underlying behavior? So if you're with a group that you currently work with, or you want to go grab someone who you work with, a student that you've been talking about, have this conversation just 5 minutes, and just thinking about, is there another way we can be thinking about this challenging behavior? So just take 5 minutes now to do that.
You got a name or you got a name? Oh, no, I didn't. So challenging yeah, that's also and tries to have you go
Like to her, it seems that it's just doing nothing. All right, we'll come back together here really quickly, finishing up those conversations. Thank you to everyone who's been having such engaged conversation with each other. It's amazing to have that time to really just break down some of this work together. So we are going to go into a quick break, about 15 minutes. I want you to think about during your break time, nothing but break. Don't have these conversations. Take a quick break, have some social time. We'll come back and we'll talk about social emotional learning and sort of how we can start to target not just our attitudes, beliefs, and environments, but now what can we do in practice? What are those supports that we can use? So it is 10 o'clock right now. We'll do 10:15 for a break back. If there's coffee and snacks back there. If you want to come grab me for a question, I'll be here for the break as well. But otherwise, we'll have time to talk again in the second part. Thank you.
I know.